Hello again, everyone. Welcome back for another episode of Chaos by Tom O'Neill and Dan Piepenbring. We're on chapter 3 now, and I have a tiny bit of a headache, so we'll see how much we can get through. All right, so chapter 3 is called The Golden Penetrators. Kind of gross, and yeah. Okay, part 1, Instilling Fear. Maybe I was naive to think I could discover what was going on at the Tate house in the months before the murders. People had been trying to untangle that rat's nest of rumors for 30 years, and not with a magazine deadline looming in front of them. Now I'd determined to my satisfaction that Frykowski and Polanski had a lot to hide, and that their connections to the drug trade could have put them plausibly in Manson's orbit. Beyond that, my sense of Manson's link to Hollywood was still too tenuous for my liking. And if I felt that Bugliosi's helter-skelter motive was only a high-profile contrivance, I needed to find the bald truth it concealed. Hoping for a better angle, I focused on one figure who was among the most perplexing in the case, Terry Melcher. Without Melcher, there would have been no murders at 150 Cielo Drive. He was the clearest link between Manson and the Hollywood elite. A music industry bigwig, he'd promised Manson a record deal only to renege on it. The official story was that Manson, reeling from the rejection, wanted to instill fear in Melcher. So he chose Melcher's old house on Cielo Drive as the site for the first night of murders. He knew that Melcher didn't live there anymore. He just wanted to give the guy a good scare. That doesn't really make sense, does it? If he knows he didn't live there, it doesn't make sense to just go kill a bunch of people to instill fear in somebody who used to live in a house. I'm not sure he would have made that connection. This was a vital point in the case. According to Bugliosi, Manson never went to the house the night of the murders. He just sent his followers there and told them to kill anyone they found. To convict Manson of criminal conspiracy then, and get him a death sentence, Bugliosi had to establish a compelling, premeditated reason that Manson had picked the Cielo Drive home. Terry Melcher was that reason. Melcher testified that he'd met Manson exactly 3 times, the last of which was around May 20th, 1969, more than 2 months before the murders. After Manson's arrest, Melcher became so frightened of the family that Bugliosi had to give him a tranquilizer to relax him before he testified. Now, I didn't think that was allowed, or maybe I'm thinking of a lie detector test. You can't have any medication or alcohol on board, as far as I'm aware, to do that, but I wouldn't think you'd be able to testify in court being on a tranquilizer. Anybody know? Let me know down below if you know. That doesn't seems a bit odd to me. 10-15 years after the murders, I'd speak to him, and he was still convinced that the Manson family was after him that night, Bugliosi had told me. If Manson had wanted to kill Melcher, he could have. He had Melcher's new address in Malibu. Greg Jacobson, a musician and a friend of the Beach Boys, had testified at the trial that Manson called him before the murders, asking him if Melcher had a green spyglass. I don't know what a spyglass is. I don't know if they're talking about a telescope or what. I'm not sure. Yes, why, Jacobson answered. Well, he doesn't anymore, Manson said. The family had creepy crawled Melcher's Malibu home. That's what they called it when they dressed up in black and sneaked around rich people's places and stolen the spyglass. When Melcher himself testified, he confirmed that he'd noticed it missing around late July or early August. Candace Bergen, his girlfriend, had noted the disappearance too. Over the years, Manson researchers have generally agreed that Melcher was stretching the truth. Melcher may have been vague about the details of his meetings with Manson and probably shaved a couple of visits to the ranch off the official record. It would be one thing to fudge the numbers a bit. It's easy to see why someone would want to understate their relationship with Charles Manson, that's for sure. But I became convinced that this was graver than that. I found proof that Melcher was much closer to Manson, Tex Watson, and the girls than he'd suggested. A year before the murders, he'd even lived with a member of the family at the house on Cielo Drive. What? Any of you know that? There was a strong likelihood that Melcher knew, immediately after the crimes, that Manson was involved, but he never told the police. I found evidence that Melcher lied on the stand, under oath, And Bugliosi definitely knew about it, which that's a huge deal. I mean, something like that could possibly get a case turned over. And especially a case like this, you really want those people out on the streets? No. Maybe he'd even put him up to it, suborning witness perjury. That would be a real crime. Just like the omissions about Polanski's sex tape and Frykowski's episode with Billy Doyle, this raised questions about Bugliosi's motives. Did he change the story to protect Melcher, a powerful record producer and the only child of one of Hollywood's most beloved stars? Had he streamlined certain elements for the jury's sake, in the interest of getting an easy conviction? Or was this part of a broader pattern of deception, of bending the facts to support a narrative that was otherwise too shaky to stand? Helter Skelter, the motive, and Helter Skelter, the book, seemed more illusory by the day. Now, I did read the book Helter Skelter prior to starting this little journey with you guys. And it's interesting to see, as I read along, the differences that I've noticed in the official narrative, which supposedly Helter Skelter is. Chasing the Melcher angle further imperiled any chance of hitting my deadline. It soured my relationship with Bugliosi. It brought on the first of many lawsuit threats, and it turned my fascination with the case into a full-blown obsession. But it convinced me more than anything that I was onto something, that the full story behind the Manson murders had never been properly told. I live with 17 girls. The story of Manson and Melcher starts with Dennis Wilson. By the summer of 1968, Wilson, then 23, had reached an impasse. He'd become world famous as the drummer for the Beach Boys, helmed by his brother Brian. Now the band was in decline, edged out by more subversive acts. He and his wife Carol had recently divorced for the second time. She wrote in court filings that he had a violent temper, inflicting severe bodily injury on her during his rampages. Okay, so he's 23. Is this his second divorce or her second divorce? Either way, that's very young to be divorced twice and to be sort of on the downward trajectory of your peak as a band. I mean, I know a lot of bands and actors, whatever, they don't necessarily have staying power, but I think it's pretty hard to take feeling like you've peaked and you're only 23 years old. The couple had 2 young children, but Dennis decided to rusticate as a bachelor. He moved into a lavish Spanish-style mansion in Pacific Palisades, once a hunting lodge owned by the humorist Will Rogers. The home boasted 31 rooms and a swimming pool in the shape of California. He redecorated in the spirit of the times, zebra print carpet, abundant bunk beds, and hosted decadent parties, hoping to have as much sex as possible. Well, that's not much of a meaningful life, if you ask me. One day, Wilson was driving his custom red Ferrari down the Pacific Coast Highway when 2 hitchhikers, the families Ella Jo Bailey and Patricia Krenwinkel, caught his eye. He gave them a quick lift. When he saw them again soon afterward, he picked them up a second time, taking them back to his place for milk and cookies. History hasn't recorded what kind of cookies they enjoyed, or whether those cookies were in fact sex, but whatever the case, the girls told Manson about the encounter. They weren't aware of Wilson's clout in the music industry, but Manson was. Remember, he wants to be a famous musician. He insisted on going back to the house with them. After a late recording session, Wilson returned to his estate to find the family's big black bus parked outside. His living room was populated with topless girls. Whatever alarm he felt was eased when their short, intense, unwashed leader, Manson, sunk to his knees and kissed Wilson's feet. This night ushered in a summer of ceaseless partying for Wilson. Manson and the family set up shop in his home, and soon Manson recruited one of the group's deadliest members, Tex Watson, who picked him up hitchhiking. All this hitchhiking, I don't know. The family spent their days smoking dope and listening to Charlie strum the guitar. The girls made the meals, did the laundry, and slept with the men on command. I don't see what they think is in it for them, to be honest. It sounds pretty awful. Manson prescribed sex 7 times a day, before and after all 3 meals, and once in the middle of the night. What? It was as if we were kings just because we were men. Watson later wrote. Soon Wilson was bragging so much that he landed a headline in the Record Mirror. I live with 17 girls, so that was the headline in the Record Mirror. So obviously they did have a connection, maybe a pretty strong connection to the family, not just a passing phase. Talking to Britain's Rave magazine, Wilson offered disjointed remarks about his new friend, whom he called the Wizard. I was only frightened as a child because I didn't understand the fear, he said. Sometimes the Wizard frightens me. The Wizard is Charles Manson, who is a friend of mine, who thinks he is God and the devil. He sings, plays, and writes poetry, and may be another artist for Brother Records, the Beach Boys label. This last bit excited Manson, who was desperate to leverage his connection with Wilson into a music career. The two co-wrote a song, Cease to Exist, whose lyrics claimed that submission is a gift. Later that year, the Beach Boys recorded it as a B-side, changing the title, finessing the lyrics, and dropping Manson's songwriting credit. That probably made him very angry. A snub that fueled his anger toward the establishment. Manson fraternized with some of the biggest names in music. Neil Young remembered meeting him and the girls at Wilson's place. A lot of pretty well-known musicians around LA knew Manson. Young later said, though they'd probably deny it now. Yeah, the more you read this, pretty much like a majority of people that Tom O'Neill tried to interview, or even 30 years later, were like, nope, their lips were sealed shut. They did not want to talk about their knowledge of him. Among these was Terry Melcher. He and Wilson had pledged allegiance to the Golden Penetrators. This is so gross, you guys. A horny triumvirate that they'd formed with their friend, Greg Jacobson. So Melcher, Wilson, and Jacobson. Penetrators, who'd painted a car gold to celebrate themselves, aimed to sleep with as many women as they could. Wilson's ex-wife referred to them as roving coxmen. Gross. Obviously then, Melcher wouldn't want to rove to Wilson's house, or he would want to rove to Wilson's house. It was full of promiscuous young women. Sometime in that summer of '68, at one of Wilson's marathon parties, he crossed paths with Manson for the first time. After another such party, Melcher rode back to Cielo Drive with Wilson, and Manson came along in the back seat. As Melcher later testified, Manson got a good look at the house from the driveway. When the end of summer came, things went south with Wilson, who'd finally grown tired of footing the bill for the endless party. I bet he did. Upward of $100,000. This was in the 70s, so that's multiples of that now, obviously. In food, clothes, and car repairs, plus gonorrhea treatments. Well, if you're doing it 7 times a day, I mean, gosh, what else is there to say? According to Bugliosi, Wilson was too frightened of Manson to throw him out. Instead, he simply up and left in the middle of the night, leaving the messy business of eviction to his landlord. That's pretty cowardly, although I don't know how you get Manson and all those women out. Probably the only option he had, to be honest. But it must have been more complicated than that. Wilson gave 3 interviews in which he raved about Manson and the girls, and all of those interviews date to the winter and summer of 1969, nearly a year after he and the family had supposedly parted ways. Why would Wilson brag about his connections to a man he'd just schemed to escape? That's a good question, huh? The only sure fact is that Manson and his group decamped to the Spahn Ranch in late August 1968. Wilson moved into a Malibu beach house with Greg Jacobson, who'd also recently split from his marriage. You know, I don't think the whole music industry / Hollywood, just these lifestyles and people throwing themselves on people just because they're rich and famous, just never seems to lead to happy, long marriages. I mean, obviously there's exceptions, but I don't know. That's not a life I would want for myself or my children. Having drifted from Wilson, his best shot at a record deal, Manson knew he had to hitch his wagon to Terry Melcher's star. As his chances at fame dwindled, his mood darkened. He became obsessed with the Beatles' White Album, released in late November 1968, and started to preach about the prophecies of a race war embedded in its lyrics. Things only got worse in the winter of 69. I wonder if he means 68, because 69 is when the murders happened. I think it means the winter of 68. When he arranged for Melcher to come out and hear his music, Manson prepared meticulously for the prospective meeting, but Melcher stood him up. On March 23rd, a desperate Manson went searching for Melcher, thinking he could goad the producer into a record deal. He found his way back to the house at Cielo Drive, having remembered that Melcher lived there. Instead, Sharon Tate's personal photographer intercepted him. He'd never heard of a Terry Melcher. He told Manson to go to the guest house and ask the owner of the property, Rudy Altabelli, who explained curtly that Melcher no longer lived there and hadn't left a forwarding address. Manson prevailed on Greg Jacobson, still a friend and still a fan of the girls, to book another session with Melcher. This time it worked. That May, Melcher made the winding drive to the Spahn Ranch and auditioned Manson in person, visiting twice over 4 days. Manson had rounded out a dozen or so of his best songs, with backup singing from the girls. Performing in a gully in the woods, the girls sprawled on the ground and gazed up at their leader, who sat astride a rock with his guitar. I wasn't too impressed by the songs, Melcher would later testify. I was impressed by the whole scene, by Charlie's strength and his obvious leadership. As a courtesy, the producer complimented Manson, saying that one or two of his songs were nice. He had no intention of offering a record contract, but he saw how the family's rustic, cultish life would lend itself to a TV documentary, probably a reality show these days, right? Melcher suggested that his friend Mike Deasy, whose van was outfitted to make field recordings, could come out to the ranch and capture another performance. So he must not have been too put off by him if he's going to come back, right? Before Melcher could get out of there, a foreman at the ranch came stumbling out of a pickup truck, drunk and belligerent. He was dressed like a cowboy, fingering a holstered gun, the same one that would later be used at the Tate murders. Manson stepped up to him and shouted, "Don't draw on me, effer," socking him in the gut, taking his gun, and continuing to pummel him. It spooked Melcher. Here was a peace and love cult with naked girls roaming the old Western sets, and yet the constant threat of violence loomed over the place. It needed to be documented in all its oddity. A few days later, Melcher returned with Deasy and Jacobson, and the family repeated their audition. But what had seemed spontaneous now felt rehearsed. Deasy returned a few more times until he had a frightening LSD trip with Manson and vowed to never go back. It was all getting too toxic. Melcher conveyed his rejection through Jacobson, and that was the end of that. Manson's last brush with greatness was gone, and he became full-on apocalyptic. Melcher never went back to the ranch or saw anyone from the family again. Or so he said under oath anyways. After the murders, as Hollywood panicked and the LAPD chased down leads, the Golden Penetrators realized that they hadn't quite washed their hands of Manson. This is where their story began to feel unbelievable to me. Manson wasn't charged with murder until late November, but Wilson, Jacobson, and Melcher had good cause to suspect him back in August, right after the killings. So the killings happened in early August. By then, they were frightened of Manson, though Helter Skelter does little to indicate their terror. When I saw, it's true, it's not really, it's a blip in that book. When I saw how much they knew and how quiet they kept, when their information would have helped police solve the case, I realized just how flimsy the Helter Skelter motive was. Its unforgettable grandiosity may have hidden a more prosaic truth, that a few rich guys had gotten in over their heads with an unstable ex-con. First, Wilson and Jacobson knew that Manson had shot a black man named Bernard Crowe about 5 weeks before the Tate murders, so they knew about that. And Jacobson, who testified that he'd talked to Manson upward of 100 times, was well acquainted with his friend's bizarre race war predictions. Manson warned him that whiteys in the affluent homes of Bel Air would be cut up and dismembered, and that the murders would smear the victims' blood on the walls, scatter their limbs, and hang them from the ceiling. Sorry guys, I know that's gross, but it is what it is. And yet, when a group of affluent whites really was cut up, Jacobson apparently didn't make the connection. Yeah, that is odd, because it's such a horrific thing, and so unbelievable. It's like you hear a crime like this happening every day. You would think if you had heard someone threaten the very same type of crime that you would think, wait a second, somebody I know, just threatened this and then it happened. I wonder if I should go to the cops, Nor did it occur to him in mid-August when he witnessed Manson's violence firsthand. Manson broke into Jacobson's home in the middle of the night, shook him awake, and produced a bullet. Tell Dennis there are more where this came from, he said. That's horrifying. He said, on the witness stand, Jacobson compared Manson that night to a caged bobcat. The electricity was almost pouring out of him. His hair was on end. His eyes were wild. Now, have you ever seen anything with Manson where his eyes were not wild? He has some creepy eyes. A few days earlier, Manson had showed up at Wilson's house too, demanding $1,500. When Wilson refused to give him the money, Manson threatened him. Don't be surprised if you never see your kid again. I guess if somebody's threatening me with something like that, I might think twice about speaking up too, that is a scary thing. After Manson's arrest, Wilson fell into a deep depression, spurring his problems with drugs and alcohol. Later, he told the Beach Boys' authorized biographer, David Leaf, I know why Charles Manson did what he did. Someday I'll tell the world. So this is Dennis Wilson saying that. Someday I'll tell the world. I'll write a book and explain why he did it. He never got the chance. In 1983, 3 weeks after his 39th birthday, an acutely drunk Wilson dove from the deck of his boat into the chilly waters of Marina del Rey and accidentally drowned. I believe I read somewhere his blood alcohol content was like 0.26, which is like 3 times the legal limit in California. Within days, a rock journalist wrote in the San Francisco Chronicle about the jarring exchange he'd had with Wilson. Me and Charlie, we founded the family, Dennis had said, apropos of nothing. So Dennis was saying that he and Charlie founded the family? That's very interesting. I don't think it's true. Well, in any account we've read, it's not. But it makes you think, because that's definitely not in the official narrative. The Golden Penetrators then had an abundance of reasons to accuse Manson of the Tate LaBianca murders immediately. They believed he'd shot someone dead. He'd threatened 2 of them with violence. They knew he stockpiled guns and knives at the ranch. And the slaughter at Melcher's old house was exactly the kind he'd predicted, down to the most chilling detail. Shouldn't they have connected the dots? Was it possible that there was a conspiracy of silence among them? I don't know. It seems like most people would put 2 and 2 together, especially knowing that he was capable of, he thought that he killed that guy that he thought was a Black Panther and wasn't. So, I don't know. All right, the next section is called Asshole Buddies. Rudy Altabelli, the owner of the house on Cielo Drive, Tate and Polanski's landlord, and Terry Melcher's before that, became one of my best sources. It was thanks to him that I started looking into Melcher's story in the first place. When I met up with Altabelli in the spring of 1999, he'd never publicly spoken about the murders that had occurred at his house, except in trial testimony. I wasn't sure why he'd agreed to talk now, and to me of all people. I heard it would be a waste of time even to bother asking. But Altabelli had always been unpredictable. One of the first openly gay men in Hollywood, he made a living as a manager. His clients included Henry Fonda and Katharine Hepburn. In November 1969, 3 months after the murders, before the killers had been found, he shocked the community by filing a lawsuit against Polanski and Sharon Tate's father to recover the damages to his property. The damages his property had sustained during the murders. So this clown sues the family of murder victims to clean up his house. Can you even? That is unconscionable. I mean, yikes. It was an appallingly callous response to seek money from a victim's family because she'd bled on Altabelli's carpet as she lay dying. Yeah, that is beyond the pale. I knew then that I'd have to tread carefully with Altabelli. I met him at a restaurant in Hollywood. Compact and nattily dressed, he was a few weeks shy of his 70th birthday. but he had no lines on his face and no gray in his hair. Well, that's Hollywood for you, right? They got all kinds of tricks that you and I don't have. After dinner that night, he kept calling to chat, and I took him out for years to come. The restaurants were always fancy, the bills were always mine, and I always felt, through hundreds of hours of conversation, that I wasn't getting the whole story. His go-to defense was unchanging. I may not tell you everything, but I've never lied to you. If I printed anything without his permission, he said, I'll find you and cut your balls off and feed them to you. Fortunately, he later decided it was all on the record. That's a threat that most men would probably take seriously. Altabelli had bought the Cielo house in 1963. In May 1966, he rented to Melcher, who was known at the time for having produced The Birds, Mr. Tambourine Man, and Turn, Turn, Turn. Altabelli liked to befriend his tenants. He lived in the guest house and rent out the main property, and soon the two became what he called asshole buddies. An affectionate term, he assured me. Not only was Altabelli one of the few people who befriended both Melcher and Tate, he was one of the few who'd seen Manson on the property before the murders. So Manson had been on the property. Before, we had just heard that he had seen it from the street. But this is telling a little different story. He provided critical testimony for the state, identifying Manson as the man who'd barged into his guest house looking for Terry Melcher in March of 1969. His ID was reliable. He'd already met Manson at Dennis Wilson's house the summer before. I didn't like the vibe from him, Rudy added. I even told Terry to keep those people off the property. It sounded like Altabelli and others in his circle had suspected Manson from the start. See, that was definitely not in the official narrative. Nobody knew anything about anything. That was what it said in Helter Skelter. And that was true, Altabelli said. When he heard about the murders, he thought of Manson right away. Altabelli was in Rome at the time, and his memories troubled him enough that within hours of the murder, before he'd even boarded a flight home, he called his lawyer, Barry Hirsch, who told him he should mind his own business. That's a lawyer for you, though, huh? Don't say a word. Altabelli returned to LA, hoping to move back into his house right away. Man, can you imagine just moving back? I know he lived in the guest house, but I don't think I'd want to go anywhere near that house. I don't think I could do it. The LAPD forbade him. Instead, he crashed with Melcher and Candace Bergen at their place in Malibu. That house belonged to Doris Day, Melcher's mother, but she seldom used it. During Altabelli's stay, Greg Jacobson stopped by and invited him for a walk on the beach. As they strolled along the surf past beautiful oceanfront homes, fortified in recent weeks with fences, guard dogs, and security systems, Jacobson told him about the musician that Manson was supposed to have killed. That, I don't know if we've talked too much about, was Gary Hinman. Altabelli didn't remember the musician's name. I wondered if he was thinking of Gary Hinman, a musician who'd been killed by the family 13 days before the Tate LaBianca murders. If Jacobson knew about that murder, he would have almost certainly connected the Tate LaBianca deaths to Manson too. Now, Susan Atkins was part of that Hinman murder, and she was in jail for it. And a lot of how they found out anything was because she, had a very, she wasn't quiet about it in jail, and somebody snitched on her. So that was a huge break in the case. That day on the beach, Jacobson reached into his pocket and pulled out a bullet. He said, "This one's for Terry." It was from Manson. He's just walking around with this thing in his pocket. Must have made a mark on him if that's the case, right? During the trial, Jacobson had said that after the murders, Manson broke into his house, gave him a bullet, and told him to show it to Dennis Wilson. The message, there are more where this came from. Maybe Altabelli was getting all of it mixed up, but he was insistent. No, he said it was for Terry. Then why didn't he tell Terry about it? Because when I'm told to mind my own business by my attorney, I mind my own business. In fact, I should be minding my own business now and shut up. How could Altabelli have spent so much time with Melcher, doing nothing but discussing the tragedy and speculating on possible culprits, without sharing this crucial information, without telling his friend that there was a bullet with his name on it? That's not a very good friend, is it? He knew it would have helped solve the case. Altabelli did say that he called his attorney one more time to fill him in. He was told again to mind his own business. If Altabelli was telling the truth, then all four of these men, him, Melcher, Wilson, and Jacobson, the main links between Manson, Hollywood, and the house on Cielo Drive, had to know that Manson was behind the murders. And yet all they wanted to do was forget about it. Denial, I guess, is a strong thing, right? 3 weeks after the crimes, Altabelli moved back into the house on Cielo Drive with Melcher as his new roommate. What? So Melcher moved back in after that? An arrangement that's never been reported before. Altabelli returned out of a desire to reclaim his home from the evil that had infested it. He hoped to restore some order to the place. By then, it had become a morbid mecca for Hollywood's elite, who came by wanting a glimpse at the scene of the crimes. That is so gross, you guys. I don't know. I would not want to go see that. Like, 5 people, 6 if you count the baby, which I do, lost their lives, and people just want to make it into this gruesome scene. Disgusting. Even Elvis Presley came to pay his respects. Altabelli turned most of these visitors away, but he welcomed Melcher, who expressed a bizarre yearning to stay in his old place again. That is weird. That's weird. With Altabelli's blessing, Melcher lived there for a month, maybe longer. He hardly left the property. He probably figured it was safe there, Altabelli said, that lightning wouldn't strike twice. Melcher came alone. He seemed to have split up with Bergen. She probably didn't want to go back there. Settling back into the house, he became morose, as Altabelli remembered, wandering around in a daze and drinking heavily. Another friend, the screenwriter Charles Eastman, who lived several doors down on Cielo Drive, said that Melcher showed up at his place wearing Wojtek Frykowski's clothing. What? That is so weird. I said, this is too gruesome. This is ugly. I don't like this. What is possessing him to do that? Maybe it's a guilty conscience. I don't know. Melcher was living out his attachment to the place in macabre ways. He felt, as everyone did, that the house was sacred. What in the world? Sacred? He loved it so much that he even tried to talk Altabelli into selling it to him, which made me wonder, why had he and Bergen ever moved out? That is a good question if it's such a sacred place and you live there. And I read somewhere that they moved out months before their lease was up. That's interesting. Bugliosi hinted in Helter Skelter that their departure was abrupt, but he never said why. They left in the middle of the night with no warning and 4 months left on the lease. Altabelli told me. Terry blamed it on their housekeeper. Now this is the weirdest thing I've ever heard. He blamed it on their housekeeper. He said they were frightened of her, that she was domineering and a drunk. Why would you not just fire the housekeeper? That makes absolutely zero sense in the world. That was the only way he knew to get rid of her. Lame. Melcher and Bergen, both privileged children of Hollywood royalty, were so frightened of a housekeeper that they'd sooner move out of a house they love than fire her? That does not add up, guys. A power couple, scared of the maid. Eastman was convinced that something else was to blame. Melcher knew that Manson was after him. Altabelli and Melcher were always being pestered by strange visitors, girls with funny names, he said, like maybe Squeaky. My feeling was that Rudy and Terry both had a reason to be uncomfortable about Manson and his people. Eastman had even written about it in his journal in March 1969. He read the entry to me. Rudy criticizes Terry for leaving behind so many cats when he moved. When I asked him why Terry moved, he tells me it was money, that Terry became peeved at the rent, remembering Terry's love of the house and how many times, according to Rudy, that Terry offered to buy the house from him. It seems odd to me that he moved away so suddenly, so abruptly. None of this had ever come out before. Other friends of Melcher agreed that he and Bergen had snuck out in the middle of the night because of threats from the family. Melcher was afraid of them, one source told me. They said, if you don't produce our album, we'll kill you. After the murders, Melcher seemed really guilty. That survivor's guilt, maybe. He probably felt he should have said to the new tenants, Tate and Polanski, don't rent the house. There are these people who've been harassing me there. That would have been a, polite thing to do. Altabelli gave me the number for Carol Wilson. Dennis Wilson's ex-wife. It was after their second separation that Dennis had taken up with Manson and the girls, much to Carol's chagrin. The two shared custody of their 2 kids. Later, I would hear from a reliable source that Carol had had photos taken at Dennis's house, capturing him cavorting naked around the pool with women from the family. She used them to pressure Dennis, getting him to agree to her terms in the divorce. I would have too. I wouldn't want my kids around that scene. Carol kept careful tabs on her ex's goings-on. She kept a diary from the day Dennis first met Tex Watson, Altabelli told me. It has everything in it. Everything on Terry. She hates him. That seems like it'd be admissible in court if someone knew about it. Meanwhile, she pursued a romance with Jay Sebring. That's interesting, because he was one of them that was murdered too, which I'd never seen reported before. It felt significant, in light of the fact that her ex-husband had been intertwined with Sebring's killers. It was just before the weekend when I reached Wilson. I told her that I was exploring the possibility that her former husband and his friends had been more involved with the Manson family than previously reported, and I wondered if Manson's reach in Hollywood was further than had been known. Yes, it sure was, she replied. She asked that I call her back on Monday. We could meet for coffee. When Monday came, though, she changed her mind. I thought long and hard over the weekend, she said, and I can't talk to you. There were a lot of people involved, she explained. Too many. It's a scary thing, she said, and anyone who knows anything will never talk. That is interesting. If I were a reporter checking in on this, that would make me crazy. Like, wait a second. There's a lot more people that know a lot more things, but nobody's talking. I couldn't draw her out on that. She suggested that I talk to Melcher and Jacobson, but she wouldn't put me in touch. Meanwhile, I'd started to hear more sordid stuff about Melcher's affiliation with the family. Bob April, a retired carpenter who'd been a fringe member of the family, told me with confidence that Manson would supply girls for executive parties that Melcher threw, giving well-heeled business types unfettered access to Manson's girls. That is just sick. Sick, sick, sick. But what would Manson get in return? That's why everyone got killed, April said. He didn't get what he wanted, aka a record deal, right? Melcher had promised Manson a record deal on Day Labels, his mother's imprint. But Doris Day took one look at Manson and laughed at him and said, "You're out of your mind if you think I'm going to produce a fucking record for you." Excuse my language. Said it to Charlie's face. Well, I'm surprised he didn't go right after her, but I guess going after her child would be a way of getting back at her too. But it doesn't sound like he did go after the child. And it was going after someone in the house that you used to live at. That sounds absurd. Does that not sound absurd? Melcher and Manson knew each other very well, April said. I've tried to get this out for years. So that's the first half of chapter 3. What did you guys think? What do you think about Melcher wanting to go back to that house? Why did they think it was sacred? I heard some pretty scandalous things happen to that house. A lot of filming of not so kosher movies and who knows what else. But why was it sacred, and why did they leave so quickly? But more bizarrely, why did he come back and live there for a while and wear Frykowski's clothing? That's horrifying. That's weird. That is weird. All right, guys, what did you all think about that? Thank you all for sticking around. I had a sick kiddo, so I had a little lapse there. Yeah, we'll be on to the next half of chapter 3 in the next one. All right, guys, I will see you in the next one. Take care. Bye.